Who Comes with Cannons? Chapter 1. Kettle cousin indeed. The name stung. Hearing Robert's voice say that stopped Truth Hopkins in her tracks. She stood on the porch behind the partly open door to the kitchen, listening. Cold gusts of the March 1861 wind blew around her. Truth heard her cousin Robert's words clearly, and they were like a stab to the heart. That's what she is, Ma, a kettle cousin, another mouth to feed. Thee knows what kettle cousins are supposed to do. Lick the pot when the rest of us get done with our food. And besides, she can bring us trouble with the law. Thy name for thy cousin Truth is cruel, Robert, said Truth's Aunt Elizabeth. It is not her fault or shame she was sent to us with only her carpetbags and what she stood up in. 19-year-old Robert was fuming as he went on. We didn't get any warning she was on her way from Indiana. Only the letter sent along with her by Pa's brother-in-law, Hamish, saying that he couldn't take her with him to the hospital in California. She's only 12. She should have left her with some folks back there. And what kind of name is Truth anyway? It's Tabitha Ruth, as thee very well knows, but we shall call her Truth. As she says, Tabitha Ruth is difficult to say. Remember, she can be a help to me. Thee and Todd will make her welcome, and feel a sister to thee. Like thee, too, she was reared a friend. She'll go to the meeting house with us on meeting day. Truth heard Robert's mumbled reply. Then make her wear a bonnet. Folks stared at her in Goldsboro when Pa, Todd, and I met her at the train. It's that yellow hair she's got, and, yes, I know, Robert, though she wears our plain dark dress, she stands out. Her hair is butter bright and curly, and her cheeks are too highly colored. She is a friend, so she will wear a Quaker bonnet, but she is not at fault for the coloring the Lord gave her. Truth sucked in her breath. Too bright to be a good friend? What was she to do? Get some flour from the bin and dust it on her cheeks to make them pale? Now exasperated, Truth set her lips in a firm line. Well, she would show Mr. Robert Bardwell she was a faithful friend and a good hard worker. She was no stranger to work in houses, gardens, and fields. She could scrub and weed and tend to animals, and she could pick and chop cotton. She was fleet of foot, too. She'd already won 2 foot races against bigger girls at her new school, and she had attended it only a few days. Robert spoke again. I wish she hadn't come. She doesn't know anything about our work. Robert, what we do here is done mostly by night. I've taken note that she sleeps heavily, and she sleeps at the front of the house, where she can't see what goes on near the barn. Ma, do they do the same work in Indiana as we do? Yes, son, but since Indiana is a northern state, perhaps they don't do it as often as we must in the south. I do not think Hamish took part in our work, though. Truth's mother was ill with consumption so much of her life. What we do is done by the strongest of us. I know that, Mom, but our cuddle cousin could find out any time. So she could. If she does, we shall have to put our trust in her. That is all we can do. Truth heard her aunt sigh. She sounded weary. Aunt Elizabeth's face was long and kindly looking, and her blue eyes were as calm as summer skies. She'd passed on her straight, dark brown hair to her sons, and they resembled her and not her stocky, short, sandy-bearded husband, Matthew, who seldom spoke. Truth liked her. Right now, Aunt Elizabeth was kneading bread dough for the Saturday baking. She was a good farm wife, and her husband was a good farmer. Raised on a farm herself, Truth could judge the worth of the Bardwells' North Carolina farm. Their animals were sleek, and their fields of corn and cotton would yield abundantly this summer. Anyhow, she would show her mother's people how valuable she could be as a farm girl. They'd need no hired hand girl with her around. And she'd do well at school, too, because her aim was to become a nurse someday, but back in Indiana, not in the South. At home, she had heard plenty about the southern states, and she hadn't liked it a bit. But here she was now. If war came, she would ask to be sent home to some folks who she knew would take her in. That's what Pa told her to do. Her forehead creasing in thought, Truth wondered what went on in this peaceful place at night. Would she find out? And why did her being here worry Robert? It must be something dangerous. He talked about the law. Truth let out a tiny sigh. Going to a new meeting house would be a trial for her. It seemed far easier for old people to behave properly and not fuss and fidget in the silence as they waited for the inner light to come to them, and inspire them to speak aloud. What courage it would take to dare to speak out, and what confidence in what one had to say. Did the light have to be grown into, like wisdom? Silly thoughts of running races and climbing apple trees and sometimes lines of poetry came flooding into her mind while she sat in the silence. She tried to whisk them away with a mental broom, but they came back to torment her and make her want to smile or laugh and betray by her expression what they were. From where she stood on the porch, Truth could see her Uncle Matthew's broad-brimmed straw hat on its nail by the door. Burning tears sprang to her eyes. It was just like Pa's hat, the one he'd worn in the fields. Pa. The doctors had told him he needed warmth and dryness for his lungs, so he rented their farm to some neighbors and left for a doctor's sanatorium, a place for sick people on the edge of the California desert. Truth stifled a sob. No matter how she begged Pa, he refused to take her with him. No, she hadn't truly been fooled. Pa went out there thinking he would die. However, he hadn't sent her away penniless, as Robert had claimed. She had $20 in gold knotted in a handkerchief in her bodice. It was her own money. She'd earned it watching children and helping neighbor women in their gardens. This was her secret. If anybody took a stick to her here, that gold would take her away. Pa, how she missed him. He was tall and lanky, like Abraham Lincoln, but unlike him, Pa was fair-haired and, alas, always coughing like Ma did before she died. Truth, came her aunt's soft voice. Are thee done with getting the eggs from the hen house? Are thee on the porch now? Truth silently stepped some paces backwards and then stomped on the boards as if she had just come up the steps stumbling. Her relations wouldn't like it if they found out she'd been eavesdropping. I'm here, she called out. I've got 12 eggs, 7 white ones and 5 brown ones. Pushing open the back door, she came inside with the basket and laid it on the table beside the empty bread pans. As she came in, she saw Robert go out through the parlor door. Her aunt said, The wind in March is cold. Take off thy coat and help me butter the pans. That's a good girl. She smiled. I hope thee likes it here, child. Thee does not know, but I always hoped to be blessed with a daughter. Did thee? Asked Truth, still holding the basket's handle. Yes. When I heard of thy birth to my husband's sister, I felt I envied her. My boys were already in school. Finished with her kneading, Aunt Elizabeth turned and asked, Does thee think thee could become my daughter, Truth? Her eyes lowered as she let go of the basket and took off her coat. Truth answered quietly, I don't know that yet, Aunt Elizabeth. The older girl laughed. Thee is rightly named, Truth. Many girls would have said yes to keep the peace. I will be frank, too. We did not anticipate thee coming to us. Thy father did not write. Thy uncle and I are pleased to keep thee, and so is thy cousin Todd. However, Robert believes as we do that a war is brewing, and fears thee could be a burden to us when it comes. Truth said firmly, I won't be. I can take care of myself. I think thee can, and child, never think thee is a kettle cousin to us. Truth's head jerked up in surprise, and a flush colored her face. Her aunt knew. How did thee? The wind. It blew a wisp of thy hair through the door and then blew it back. Those who eavesdrop will seldom hear good of themselves. Thee is forgiven. There are things thee might have heard Robert say, but put them out of thy head. They do not concern thee. Truth disagreed, especially if the things had to do with the law. Still, she had her tongue so as not to stir up trouble. The next day, first day, or what other people called Sunday, Matthew Bardwell drove his wife, sons, and niece to the meeting house. Like her aunt, Truth wore dark clothing and a black, coal-scuttle-shaped Quaker bonnet. In order to see either of their faces, someone would have had to stoop down and look up inside. Not a single strand of Truth's hair showed to shine in the cold March sunshine. The Bardwell men wore their best clothing, white shirts and black suits with black, broad-brimmed hats. Truth looked about as they took the road leading from the farm. They passed the Bardwells' wide fields on either side. Trees not yet leafed out grew thickly on one side of the road. On the other was the orchard Truth knew consisted of apple and peach trees. She'd been to the root cellar and seen last year's apples still sweet and crisp down there, along with pumpkins, potatoes, and yams. Her home in Indiana just had a loft for storing vegetables. Sitting behind her in the back of the wagon, Robert and Todd had talked from the moment they'd left home. Their voices were soft and not meant to carry over the creak of the wagon and the clopping of the dapple-gray's hooves, but Truth's ears were very sharp. Too sharp, as Pa sometimes told her. Todd, a smaller, thinner copy of his older brother, was saying, "I hear tell that Daniel Fields is coming through Goldsboro pretty soon. He's got himself a coffle almost ready. Wish we could stop him." Robert interrupted. "Well, we can't. The law is on his side, and I don't plan to see his coffle if I can help it. What road will he take to Virginia? Did he hear?" "No, Fields keeps that secret. Just thinking of him gives me a sour stomach, and I don't want it growling at me in meeting." Robert laughed and began to talk about something else. Coffle. The word struck as a question in Truth's mind. She could ask her aunt what a coffle was, but surely that would give away that she'd been eavesdropping again. Truth sensed things about North Carolina that she didn't understand clearly yet. For one thing, the Bardwell parlor was quite odd. It had the largest fireplace and slab hearthstone that she'd ever seen, except for one in a tavern in Indiana, where a cook's boy turned a spit holding roasting meat. That big fireplace was used for cooking and for heating the room. However, the Bardwells didn't cook in the parlor, and at night the room was heated by a small cast-iron stove. Truth also noticed that there was no watchdog like the dog she'd had at home. How she missed him. It couldn't be that the Bardwells didn't like animals. They had cats. Alice, the calico, even slept on her bed. Yes, there were strange things about North Carolina. A half an hour later, the Bardwell wagon pulled up to the meeting house. It was a twin of the one in Indiana, a long, low, unpainted log house as plain as could be. Truth looked about herself carefully. Dark-clad men, women, and children were going into the building. She wondered if anyone here might have known her pa. They'd surely have known her mama, because she'd grown up in this part of the South before she'd met and married Pa. Would there be any girls her own age who were the daughters of her mother's childhood friends? The girls at her new school were Methodists and Baptists. Only 2 others were Quakers. A plump girl younger than she named Lydia, and a tall, thin girl named Martha, who had given her cross looks when she'd taken off her shoes for the foot race. Back in Indiana, Quaker girls did that sort of thing, but apparently they didn't in North Carolina. Well, she would show them all what kind of friends were growing up in the West. Good ones, strong in their faith and good deeds, and able to do any work they set their hands to.